The forging, what Jung understood about years that break you open. If you have survived years that felt like slow dismemberment, years that stripped away everything you thought you were, years that left you unrecognizable even to yourself, then Carl Jung would tell you something that might sound impossible right now. He would tell you that you were not being destroyed, you were being emptied. And what can finally fill an emptied vessel is something that could never fit into who you were before. Jung spent his life studying a pattern he found in every person who achieved psychological depth. A pattern so consistent it could not be dismissed as coincidence. Every single person who became truly whole, who accessed the deepest layers of consciousness, who developed the rarest capacities of the human psyche, had first been brought to their knees by suffering they did not choose and could not escape. Not suffering they sought out, not challenges they willingly embraced, but devastation that arrived uninvited and stayed far longer than seemed survivable. And here is what Jung discovered that changes everything. The years that felt like punishment were actually preparation. The losses that felt random were actually precise. The pain that seemed designed to break you was actually designed to break you open. Because there are things the psyche cannot learn through comfort. There are capacities that only develop under pressure. There are layers of yourself that remain inaccessible until everything above them has been burned away. Your hardest years were not a detour from your path. They were the crucible. And what is being forged in that fire is something the world desperately needs but rarely sees. A human being who has descended into their own depths and returned capable of things most people will never touch. Jung understood something about suffering that most psychology ignores. He understood that pain is not just damage to be healed. It is information to be integrated. When you go through years that shatter you, when loss compounds on loss, when betrayal follows betrayal, when every structure you built collapses in sequence, the psyche is not randomly wounded. It is being systematically dismantled. And what is being dismantled is not you. It is the false architecture you built to survive a world that demanded you be smaller than you are. Think about what you were before the hard years began. You had a version of yourself that worked, a persona that earned approval, a set of beliefs that kept you safe, a way of moving through the world that minimized conflict. And that version of yourself was necessary. It got you through childhood. It helped you navigate systems that would have crushed you if you had been too authentic too soon. It allowed you to build relationships, hold jobs, maintain a sense of stability. But that version was never meant to be permanent. It was scaffolding, temporary structure around something that had not yet taken shape. And when the hard years came, when the losses arrived, when the betrayals landed, when the foundations cracked, what was actually happening was the removal of scaffolding that had served its purpose. The structure beneath, the true self, could not emerge while the scaffolding remained. Because scaffolding is rigid, protective, designed to prevent collapse. And the true self is not rigid. It is fluid, adaptive, alive in ways that structured defenses can never allow. So the psyche, in its deep intelligence, began to dismantle the scaffolding. Not gently, not gradually, but through the force of circumstances that could not be controlled or avoided. And every loss, every betrayal, every moment of feeling like you were being erased, that was another piece of scaffolding falling away. Another defense dissolving. Another false layer burned off. You felt like you were losing yourself. But Jung would tell you the opposite was happening. You were losing what was never you to begin with. And what remained, raw and exposed, was something far more real than anything you had constructed. There is a phase Jung identified that almost no one talks about. The phase between the dismantling and the rebuilding. Between the death of the old self and the emergence of the new. He called it the void, the in-between. The place where you are no longer who you were but not yet who you are becoming. If you have been through years of devastation, you know this place. It is the space where nothing makes sense. Where the old motivations no longer work but new ones have not yet appeared. Where you look at your life and feel like a stranger inhabiting someone else's existence. Most people panic in this phase. They try to rebuild immediately. They grab onto the first identity that offers stability. They rush into relationships, careers, beliefs, anything to escape the unbearable uncertainty of not knowing who they are. But Jung observed that the people who transformed most deeply were the ones who could tolerate the void. who could sit in the not knowing without rushing to resolve it, who could resist the urge to rebuild the old structure just to feel stable again. Because the void is not empty. It only feels empty because what fills it is not yet visible to the conscious mind. The void is where the unconscious does its deepest work, where the fragmented pieces of yourself are being sorted, examined, rearranged, where the parts of you that were exiled are being reintegrated, where the new structure, the one that actually fits who you are beneath all conditioning, is taking shape in the dark. You cannot see this work while it is happening. You can only feel the absence of what used to be there. The loss of certainty, the collapse of identity, the terrifying freedom of having no idea what comes next. But if you can stay in the void without collapsing into old patterns, something remarkable begins to happen. The new self does not arrive as a decision. It arrives as a recognition. One day, you notice that you are responding to situations differently, that your boundaries are clearer without effort, that you are no longer seeking approval in the ways you used to, that what once devastated you now barely registers, and you realize that you have become someone new, not through trying, not through discipline, but through the alchemical process of being broken down and reconstituted in the darkness of the void. This is what Jung meant when he said that suffering, when fully faced, does not diminish you, refines you. It burns away the impurities, the borrowed beliefs, the false identities, the strategies that kept you small, and what remains is something purer, more essential, more you. Jung spent years studying people who had emerged from profound suffering, and he noticed something that separated those who were destroyed by their pain from those who were transformed by it. It was not the severity of the suffering. Some people endured unimaginable trauma and became bitter, closed, trapped. Others endured similar trauma and became luminous, open, free. The difference was not in what happened to them. The difference was in whether they turned toward the pain or away from it. Most people, when suffering arrives, do everything they can to escape it. They numb. They distract. They construct elaborate narratives that make the pain someone else's fault. They spend years in therapy trying to make sense of it before they have actually felt it. And Jung understood why. Because feeling the pain fully, without explanation, without escape, without the comfort of knowing it will end, is terrifying. It feels like it will destroy you. Like if you let yourself feel it completely, you will dissolve into it and never return. But Jung discovered the opposite is true. The pain does not destroy you when you feel it. The pain destroys you when you avoid it. Because unfelt pain does not disappear. It goes underground. It becomes the shadow, the unconscious material that controls your life from beneath awareness. It manifests as anxiety, as rage, as self-sabotage, as patterns you repeat without knowing why. But when you turn toward the pain, when you allow yourself to feel the full weight of the loss, the betrayal, the grief, the terror, something shifts. The pain, when fully felt, begins to move. It is no longer stuck. No longer frozen in the body, no longer ruling your life from the shadows. And as it moves, it transforms. It becomes something else. Not positivity, not gratitude, but a kind of depth, a capacity to hold more than you could hold before. A resilience that is not about bouncing back, but about being fundamentally changed by what you have endured. Jung called this integration, the process of taking what was unconscious and making it conscious, of taking what was fragmented and making it whole. And the people who integrated their suffering, who felt it fully, who allowed it to change them, who did not rush to make meaning of it but simply let it work on them, these were the people who developed what Jung called psychological gold. Not happiness, not success, but something rarer. The ability to be present with darkness without being consumed by it. The ability to see clearly without becoming cynical. The ability to remain open even after being broken. This is what your hardest years have been forging in you. And most people will never develop it. Because most people will never be forced to descend as deeply as you have descended. There is something Jung observed about people who have been through the fire that he described in his private notebooks but rarely discussed publicly. He noticed that after profound suffering, after the kind of years that strip everything away, people develop a quality he called seeing through. Not seeing clearly, not seeing deeply, but seeing through, the ability to perceive what lies beneath the surface of situations, relationships, and especially other people's performances. You have probably noticed this in yourself without naming it. You can sense when someone is lying to themselves. You can feel the tension in a room before anyone speaks it aloud. You know when a relationship is ending before either person admits it. You recognize patterns in their earliest stages because you have lived through their full cycles. This is not intuition in the mystical sense. This is pattern recognition earned through devastation. When you have been betrayed, you learn to read the microsignals that precede betrayal. When you have watched structures collapse, you recognize the subtle instabilities that announce coming collapse. When you have survived your own dissolution, you can sense when someone else is standing on that same edge. And this capacity, this ability to see through, is not something that can be taught. It can only be lived into. You cannot study your way to it. You cannot practice your way to it. You can only earn it by enduring experiences that force you to see what you previously could not afford to see. Jung understood that this capacity positions you for a specific kind of work in the world. Not work in the conventional sense, though it might manifest that way, but work in the sense of function, role, of what you are here to do that others cannot do because they have not been where you have been. Most people live their entire lives on the surface. They move through prescribed paths: education, career, family, retirement. They experience pain, but they experience it within structures that contain it, explain it, make it manageable. And this is not wrong. This is how most human lives unfold. And there is value in stability, in predictability, in the comfort of a life that does not demand constant transformation. But some people, and you are one of them, are not given that option. For reasons that make no rational sense, life does not allow you to remain on the surface. It pulls you under, repeatedly, without mercy. And in the beginning, this feels like cruelty, like punishment, like evidence that you are cursed or broken or doing something fundamentally wrong. But Jung would tell you something different. He would tell you that you are not being punished. You are being prepared. Because there is work that can only be done by people who have been to the depths. Work that requires the kind of vision that only develops in darkness. Work that demands the resilience that only comes from being shattered and reassembled. And the world needs this work desperately, even if it does not know it needs it, even if it cannot name what you are becoming capable of. Think about what happens when someone who has never descended tries to help someone who is in their descent. They offer platitudes. They try to fix. They become uncomfortable with the darkness and inadvertently communicate that the person in pain should hurry up and get better. But when someone who has been to the depths sits with someone who is currently there, something different happens. There is no discomfort, no need to fix, no rush to resolution. There is only presence, the kind of presence that says, I have been where you are. I know this territory. I will not abandon you here. And I will not lie to you about how long it takes to find your way out. This presence cannot be performed. It can only be embodied. And you can only embody it by having lived through what you have lived through. Jung also discovered something about timing that most people misunderstand. He found that the payoff from years of suffering does not arrive when you expect it. It does not come as soon as the suffering ends. It does not manifest as immediate reward for enduring the pain. The payoff comes later, sometimes years later. And it comes not as external success but as internal capacity meeting external opportunity. Here is how it works. The hard years change you at a depth you cannot immediately access. They rewire your nervous system. They alter your perceptual filters. They expand your capacity to hold complexity and ambiguity. But these changes take time to integrate, time to stabilize, time to become who you are becoming rather than just surviving who you were. And during this integration period, which might feel like stagnation, like nothing is happening, like you went through all that pain for nothing, your psyche is actually consolidating the transformation, making it permanent, ensuring that the new capacities are not just temporary states but stable traits. Jung called this the gestation period, the time between conception and birth, between transformation and manifestation. And just as you cannot rush gestation without damaging what is being born, you cannot rush this psychological integration without collapsing back into old patterns. So if you are in this space right now, if you have been through years that destroyed you, if you have done the work of facing your pain, if you have allowed yourself to be changed, and yet nothing external has shifted, nothing visible has arrived to validate your transformation. Jung would tell you to trust the process. The payoff is forming. The opportunities that match your new capacities are taking shape. The people who need what you have become are moving toward you. The work you are now equipped for is preparing to reveal itself, but it cannot arrive until you are ready. And ready does not mean healed. It means integrated, stable in your new form, clear enough about who you have become that you can recognize what actually belongs to you now versus what belonged to who you were before. There is a specific phenomenon Jung documented that happens to people who have integrated profound suffering. He called it the reversal of meaning. Before the hard years, you understood your life through a certain lens. You had goals that made sense, ambitions that motivated you, definitions of success that seemed universal. But after the hard years, after the dismantling and the void and the slow reconstitution, you look at those same goals and they feel hollow. The ambitions that once drove you now feel borrowed. The definitions of success that seemed universal now reveal themselves as deeply conditional. This reversal is disorienting, because it means you cannot simply return to the life you had before. You cannot pick up where you left off. The person who would have wanted that life no longer exists. And in the gap between who you were and who you are becoming, there is often confusion. What do I want now? What matters to me? What am I actually here to do? Jung observed that these questions cannot be answered through thinking. They can only be answered through paying attention to what pulls you, what captures your attention without effort, what you find yourself drawn to even when it makes no logical sense. Because after the hard years, your psyche knows what you need in ways your conscious mind does not. Your unconscious has been reorganized by the suffering, and it is now oriented toward different things than it was before. What you are pulled toward now is not random. It is the external manifestation of your internal transformation. It is the work, the relationships, the expressions that match who you have become. But you have to trust the pull, even when it does not fit your old plans, even when it disappoints people who expected you to return to who you were, even when it requires you to abandon investments you made before you knew what you now know. Jung understood that this is where most people get stuck. They have been transformed by suffering. They have done the inner work. They have become someone new, but they are still trying to live the old life, to pursue the old goals, to be who they were before in a world that no longer fits them. And this creates a specific kind of suffering. Not the suffering of devastation, but the suffering of misalignment, of knowing you have changed but not yet allowing that change to reshape your external reality. The payoff of your hard years cannot fully manifest until you release the old life, until you stop trying to make the new you fit into the old structures, until you give yourself permission to want different things, value different things, become different things than you once thought you would. Jung spent the last decades of his life working with people in what he called the second half of life. People who had achieved what they set out to achieve, career success, family, stability, and yet found themselves profoundly empty. And what he discovered was that these people were experiencing a different kind of crisis than those in the first half of life. In the first half, the crisis is about building, about establishing yourself in the world, about proving you can survive. But in the second half, the crisis is about meaning, about whether what you have built actually matters, about whether the life you constructed serves something deeper than ego. And Jung found that the people who had been through profound suffering earlier in life, who had been forced into the depths before they were supposed to go there, these people did not experience the second half crisis in the same way. They had already confronted meaninglessness. They had already faced the void. They had already been stripped of the illusions that most people cling to until midlife or beyond. So when they reached the second half of life, they were not scrambling to find meaning. They were living from it. They had already done the work that most people avoid until they can no longer avoid it. This is one of the hidden gifts of early devastation. It forces you to confront the questions that give life depth before you have invested decades in surfaces. And while this feels like a curse when you are in the middle of it, while it feels desperately unfair that you have to face these questions while others get to remain comfortable, Jung would tell you that you are being given something rare. You are being given the opportunity to build a life from the ground up based on what is actually true for you. rather than building a life based on what you think you should want and then having to dismantle it decades later when you finally admit it was never yours. Your hard years forced the dismantling early. And yes, this was brutal. Yes, you lost things. Yes, you went through pain most people will never understand. But you also gained something most people will never access. The freedom to build from truth rather than from fear. To create from depth rather than from performance. To live in alignment with your actual self rather than in service to an image. There is a moment that comes after years of devastation. A moment Jung described, but that you can only recognize when you have lived it yourself. It is the moment when you realize you would not trade who you have become for an easier past. Not because you are grateful for the suffering. Not because you believe everything happened for a reason. But because you finally understand that the person you are now, with the depth you carry, the clarity you possess, the capacity you have developed, could not have been forged any other way. And this realization does not come as relief or triumph. It comes quietly, as a simple recognition, almost like remembering something you always knew but had forgotten. You look at your life and you see that the losses were not subtractions. They were excavations, digging down to bedrock, removing everything that was not load-bearing so that what remains can finally support the weight of what you are meant to carry. And what you are meant to carry is not light. It is not simple. It is not the kind of burden that can be shouldered by someone who has only ever lived on comfortable ground. What you are meant to carry requires the kind of strength that only develops when you have been buried and had to dig yourself out. The kind of clarity that only comes from having every illusion stripped away. The kind of presence that only emerges when you have been so completely broken that you stop defending the fragments and learn to exist as the space in which the fragments appear. Jung understood that this is what the psyche has been preparing you for all along. Not to be happy, not to be successful in conventional terms, but to be capable of holding what most people cannot hold. There is work in this world that goes unnamed, work that does not fit into job descriptions or career paths. Work that is not about what you produce but about what you can be present with. Jung called these people the wounded healers. But the term has been so misused, so sentimentalized, that it no longer captures what he meant. He was not talking about people who heal others by sharing their wounds. He was talking about people whose wounds have opened them so completely that they become conduits for transformation simply by existing in their full, undefended presence. You do not heal anyone by telling your story. You heal by becoming someone who has integrated their story so thoroughly that you are no longer identified with it. So that when someone in pain stands before you, they do not encounter your need to make meaning of suffering. They encounter someone who knows that meaning comes later, if at all, and that the only thing that matters in the moment of pain is being with what is. This cannot be taught. It can only be lived. And you have lived it. Every moment you sat alone in your devastation and did not run. Every night you lay awake feeling like you were dissolving and did not numb yourself into unconsciousness. Every time you faced the rawness of your own unmaking and did not construct a premature narrative to escape it, you were developing this capacity. And now, whether you recognize it or not, you carry a quality that is rare in this world. You carry the ability to be with intensity without being destabilized by it, to witness suffering without needing to fix it, to hold space for transformation without rushing the process. People will begin to notice this about you if they have not already. They will not always be able to name what is different, but they will feel safer in your presence. They will tell you things they do not tell others. They will ask you to witness moments they cannot witness alone. And you will understand that this is not about you being special or having answers. This is about you having been where they are, having descended and returned. And your very existence becomes proof that descent is not the end. Jung also observed something about how the payoff manifests that most people miss. They expect it to arrive as a single moment of vindication, a clear sign that all the suffering was worth it, one big thing that makes the pain make sense. But that is not how it works. The payoff arrives as 1,000 small shifts, as a gradually expanding sense of internal freedom, as opportunities that you would not have recognized before because you were looking for different things, as relationships that work differently because you are relating from a different depth. You notice that you no longer tolerate situations that require you to betray yourself. And you notice this not because you made a decision to have better boundaries, but because your nervous system simply will not let you stay in those situations anymore. The part of you that used to override your knowing for the sake of keeping peace has been burned away. You notice that you are drawn to different work. Not because you decided to make a career change, but because what once felt important now feels irrelevant, and what once felt impossible now feels like the only thing worth doing. You notice that people respond to you differently. Some become uncomfortable and withdraw. Others lean in with a kind of recognition, as if they have been waiting to meet someone who has been where they are going. These shifts are the payoff. Not a single dramatic transformation, but a fundamental reorientation of your entire existence toward truth rather than performance, toward depth rather than surface, toward what is real rather than what is acceptable. And this reorientation creates a different kind of life, not an easier life. Jung was honest about this. Once you have been to the depths, you can never again live comfortably in the shallows. Once you have seen through the performances most people call connection, you can no longer participate in them without feeling the cost. But what becomes possible is a life that is yours. Actually yours, not borrowed, not constructed from other people's expectations, not performed for approval, but sourced from the bedrock of who you are after everything false has been burned away. There is a question Jung posed late in his life that cuts to the heart of everything. He asked, what if the goal is not to be happy but to be real? What if the hard years were not obstacles to happiness but invitations to reality? What if the suffering was not punishment for being broken but preparation for becoming whole? And wholeness, Jung understood, is not the same as happiness. Wholeness includes the shadow. It includes the wounds. It includes the parts of your story that will never be resolved or redeemed or made to make sense. Wholeness is the integration of everything you are, the light and the dark, the strong and the broken, the healed and the still healing. It is the end of the war with yourself. The moment when you stop trying to be only the acceptable parts and start living as the totality. And once you achieve this, once you stop fragmenting yourself, once you stop hiding the parts that do not fit the image, you become something powerful in a way that has nothing to do with dominance or control. You become someone who cannot be manipulated by shame, because you have already faced the worst things about yourself and integrated them. You become someone who cannot be destabilized by loss, because you have already lost everything and discovered that you remain. You become someone who cannot be seduced by false promises, because you have already built a life on lies and watched it collapse. This is the payoff, not invulnerability, but a kind of groundedness that comes from knowing you have been to the bottom and there is solid ground there. That the worst has already happened and you are still here. That you have been unmade and remade and the process, though brutal, did not destroy you. If you are reading these words, if you have stayed with me through this exploration of what your hardest years were actually doing, then you are likely in one of two places. Either you are still in the middle of the fire, and these words are telling you that what feels like senseless destruction is actually meaningful transformation, that you are not being punished, that something is being forged in you that could not be forged any other way. Or you are on the other side of the fire, and these words are helping you see that the emptiness you feel, the disorientation, the sense of not knowing who you are or what you want, this is not failure. This is the integration period, the space between who you were and who you are becoming. The chrysalis stage where you cannot yet see what is forming, but it is forming nonetheless. Whichever place you are in, Jung would tell you this: do not rush. Do not try to make meaning of it prematurely. Do not let anyone convince you that you should be over it by now or that you should know what comes next. The psyche works on its own timeline, and the deeper the transformation, the longer the integration. You cannot force it. You can only trust it, and trusting it means allowing yourself to not know, to be in the space between stories, to live without the comfort of a narrative that makes everything make sense, because the payoff is not a story. The payoff is a presence, a way of being in the world that comes from having been unmade and reassembled from the inside out. And this presence does not announce itself. It does not market itself. It simply exists. And the people who need it, the opportunities that require it, the work that depends on it, they will find you. Not because you seek them out, but because you have become the kind of person they are seeking. Jung spent his final years writing about something he called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to hold opposites in tension until a third thing emerges. Something that is neither one pole nor the other, but something entirely new. Your hard years were the tension. The unbearable pressure of losing who you were while not yet becoming who you will be. Of feeling broken while simultaneously being rebuilt. Of experiencing devastation and transformation as the same event. And what emerges from this tension, the third thing, the new form, is not a return to who you were before. It is not even an improved version of that person. It is something categorically different. Someone who has been through death without dying. Someone who has been to the void and returned with the knowledge that the void is not empty, it is full of potential. Someone who has lost everything and discovered that what remains is more than enough. This is what is about to pay off. Not as a reward for suffering, but as the natural consequence of transformation. The way a seed that has been buried in darkness does not get rewarded with light. It simply grows toward it because that is what transformed seeds do. You have been buried. You have been in the darkness. And you are beginning to grow towards something that you cannot yet name, but that is calling you with increasing clarity. Trust this. Trust that your psyche knows what it is doing even when your conscious mind is lost. Trust that the hard years were not wasted. Trust that what feels like emptiness is actually spaciousness. Room for something new to take root. The payoff is already in motion. You just cannot see it yet because you are still becoming the person who will recognize it when it arrives. If these words found you at this moment, it is not by accident. Jung believed that nothing psychologically significant happens by chance. That synchronicity, meaningful coincidence, is how the unconscious speaks. And if you are here, if something in this resonated, then your psyche is ready for you to understand what your hard years were actually for. Ready for you to stop seeing yourself as damaged and start seeing yourself as forged. Ready for you to step into what you have become instead of grieving who you used to be. Leave a word below if you recognize yourself in this. Not for me, but as a marker for yourself. A moment when you stopped seeing the hard years as punishment and started seeing them as preparation. Any word, force, becoming, depth, ready, threshold. Your word is a signal to your unconscious that you are listening. That you are ready to see what has been forming in the darkness. That you are willing to let the payoff arrive in its own time and its own way rather than demanding it take a form your old self would have recognized. Jung would tell you that you are exactly where you need to be. That the hardest part is over, not because life will be easy now, but because you have developed the capacity to meet what comes without being destroyed by it. The payoff is not one thing. It is a cascade. And it begins the moment you stop waiting for external validation and start trusting the internal transformation. You are not the same person who entered the fire. And the life waiting for you on the other side is not the life that person would have lived. It is something truer, deeper, more aligned with what you actually are beneath all the conditioning and performance and trying to be acceptable. Welcome to the other side. The work you have done, whether you knew you were doing it or not, has prepared you for something most people will never touch. And it is about to become visible.